Lots of news to get through tonight. Joining me with the latest is the Daily Telegraph's National Affairs Editor and my Outsiders co-host, James Morrow. James, let's jump right into it. In my editorial, I discussed the victory of convicted terrorist Abdul Nacer Benbrika in the High Court today. Benbrika has now had his Australian citizenship restored, and former Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton cancelled it after he was found guilty of planning these terror attacks in the early 2000s. This man is an ongoing risk, and it was noted in court that he's not abandoned his extremist views, James.
Well, yeah, I mean, and there's a mystery, Rita, to all of this here. Why would Benbrika want to stay in a country that he so clearly hates? I mean, he came here from Algeria, had all sorts of crazy Islamist beliefs here, wanted to be a terrorist, wanted to lead a terrorist cell and cause mayhem, death, and destruction here on his adopted country. And yet, apparently, this place that he hates so much that he wants to commit terror attacks against its people and the nation, he still wants to stay and keep his citizenship. Rita, I simply do not get that. And I also, frankly, don't get what the High Court was talking about here, except for the fact that this seems to be a real case of sort of lawfare here in attempting to, use the courts to come at a situation that I think most people with common sense would say, no, we'll boot the guy.
Absolutely. Now to Sydney University, James, where administrators have had to shut down an event promoting a global intifada. The event, which was to be held by a socialist group today, you've covered this story. What is going on at our universities?
Well, Rita, sadly, the same thing that's been going on at so many of universities around the world, including the United States and the UK and here in Australia, of course, as well. Essentially, they wanted to have a meeting on campus at the university. They put up flyers around the place, and the flyers, Rita, were just incredible because not only did they call for a global intifada, which is an intifada, which is a terrorist uprising against, oppression, whatever they're calling it this week, but it also, the poster had on it a picture of a bulldozer that was being used by Hamas to breach the security fence in Israel on October 7, staging the way for those horrific terrorist massacres. So this is what they were glorifying. Now, I found out about this yesterday afternoon. We published a story on it, contacted the university by about 8:30 last night. They informed me that the event was not going to go ahead. But I also hear that the university, there's problems with posters of hostages being torn down, as we've seen elsewhere around the world. So, Sydney University, our universities here, Rita, are not exempt to this sort of lunatic anti-Zionist pro-Hamas shilling that we're seeing around the world, pushed by the loony academic left.
Well, we're seeing the rotten fruit of the left's march through the institutions, and that started in academia, and we're seeing the results. Now, James, you wrote an op-ed in today's Telly on former ABC journalist Stan Grant, who admitted in a recent speech that the Voice wasn't a modest request, as the PM liked to claim. And we've also got the Yes campaign, which you noted, still blaming Peter Dutton, still blaming this supposed misinformation for their fairly significant loss. It was a fairly resounding loss.
Well, it was a really resounding loss. It was 60-40. We've got, I think, the final numbers in from the AEC today. They finally, I think, counted all the last little bits and pieces, rats and mice votes around the place, and it's going to be just about 60-40, which is absolutely massive, a resounding, thumping defeat. The interesting thing, though, about Stan Grant's speech this week, Rita, is that he, did a little journalism here as a journalist, and he scooped the world and found out that, in fact, it wasn't, a modest little request, as Anthony Albanese said, but in fact a monumental idea of this Voice. So thank you, Stan Grant, for confirming everything that we've been saying, and we're called, peddlers of misinformation and panic and all sorts of things like that during the referendum campaign. Yeah, Rita, you and I, and others on this network. So we've been proven right. We've been vindicated by all of this. But, what the speech also reveals is that the yes camp, they're not going to go lightly on this. They're not going to say, oh, no, the people didn't want this. No, there's still going to be a huge effort through the courts, through other avenues, to try and get to the same place, which is treaty, which is co-sovereignty, which are all these bonkers academic ideas just by other means, since they couldn't get it at the ballot box.
Now to Melbourne, where Deputy Police Commissioner Neil Patterson has said that protesters cannot be stopped from unfurling hateful banners and performing anti-Semitic rallying cries. He implied that police would act only where there was a threat of violence or property damage. But James, we saw property damage in Melbourne CBD just Monday afternoon by these protesters. They defaced a government building and there were plenty of cops standing around and they declined to make any arrests that day.
Yeah, isn't that really interesting? And I mean, Rita, I think you and I are both pretty familiar with the scenes of the Melbourne police being somewhat more, shall we say, kinetic in their actions during COVID when people came out. And we have minutes and minutes of footage we could play, but I guess we won't do that now on that. But, it seems like the Melbourne police have gotten the New South Wales police disease, which is to avoid conflict with protesters on the Palestinian side. They just let them go and do what they want. It's entirely one-sided. I think it's actually quite cowardly because, they say, oh, well, it's all about safety. It's the same sort of thing with the guy here in Sydney who had his Israeli flag taken off and was arrested for his own good, for his own safety, briefly by the New South Wales police. And yet they let the pro-Palestinian marchers go down to the Opera House, set off flares, scream vile anti-Semitic, do horrible things to the Jews, chants, and yet, oh, no, that was fine, we'll look at the footage, maybe we'll get somebody later. It's just tremendously disheartening, I think, because this means that all of these really radical Palestinian demonstrations, they're going to be shows of force, and they're going to be used by activists to show who actually has control, and it's not, Rita, the cops.
Well, it's mob rule. If they feel like making arrests, stepping in is going to antagonise a volatile crowd, then they decline to do that. But if they think that the crowd's lawful and will go along with this, then they step in. It's just completely bonkers, like you said. Now, last night, Foreign Minister Penny Wong tweeted this, saying she is deeply concerned at reports of ongoing settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. She also demanded that those responsible must be held accountable. How is this being received, James? We know that Benjamin Netanyahu isn't taking the Prime Minister's calls, and I don't think this is going to help matters.
No, and I mean, it's like, really, Rita, settler violence in the West Bank, this is the issue that Penny Wong is talking about? Not, Hamas's crimes, not Hamas, please release the hostages? None of this stuff here. No. It's all about, oh, no, it's those Israelis, it's those Jews acting up again. They're the ones causing all the trouble. I think it sends the wrong message. I think Penny Wong has been very equivocal on this. And I think Labor has been, with a few exceptions, quite equivocal on this. We're seeing the same thing with the Democrats in the U.S. as well here. And I think it's to their shame. They're to their detriment.
Now, let's go to the US. At a Senate hearing in Washington, D.C. this week, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was interrupted by protesters who were screaming from Palestine to Mexico. All the walls have to go. Let's have a look. Oh, we don't have the grab. Imagine it. They were screaming stuff. James, tell me about this. Tell me about this disruption and the split in the Democrats when it comes to this crucial issue.
Yeah, well, this is something really, really interesting that we're seeing. It's the same thing playing out with Labor. There we had hearings, essentially kind of the equivalent of estimates hearings here in Australia. Anthony Blinken was testifying. We had those protesters come in. Oddly enough, those protesters were not dealt with, and it will not be dealt with as harshly as, say, the January 6th insurrectionists, who also interrupted proceedings on Capitol Hill, but that's another story for another night. This is, though, the great problem that the Democrats have. Labor has, too. They have a large Jewish constituency, but they also have a large Islamic constituency, more recent migrants. These migrants in the U.S., and one of the big Arab American groups has said, you have got to call for a ceasefire, Joe Biden, by 5 o'clock, I think, tomorrow, or we are going to pull our support from you for the upcoming Democratic campaign. Now, remember, in the U.S., you don't have to vote. So if those voters stay home, and in states where there's a big Arab and Muslim population, like Michigan and things like that, that could be the sort of thing that swings states one way or the other. So it's a huge domestic problem for Joe Biden, I think.
Oh, absolutely. He's got all sorts of problems. We've run out of time, James. So much more to discuss. Thank you so much for your time this evening.